boys and girls, this is Miss Henson again. Today I am giving you a lesson from the yard in my house, and we are going to be talking about animal characteristics and interdependency, or the food chain. So we're going to start out talking about animal characteristics, and we're going to use our sweet little chihuahua named Catfish. An animal characteristic that we like to kid about with him is that he's just so super cute that he gets everybody to feed him what he wants. However, that's not an animal characteristic for him. He does have some characteristics that help him to be an animal that can survive. One of the characteristics that he has is his toenails. Chihuahuas are dogs that burrow, and they actually hunt rabbits, and so he can use this to burrow in after rabbits in their little rabbit holes. Another characteristic that he has is his canines that are on his mouth, which he doesn't like you to mess with his mouth too much, but he does have teeth in here that are sharp. Catfish, goodness. And you can kind of see one hanging out right there. Maybe, there we go. Looks like he needs a teeth cleaning, but yes, he has sharp canines. And then he has these super long ears for a dog or an animal, and they help him to be able to hear things that might be trying to sneak up to get him. Now, he's so small that actually a hawk or an eagle could swoop down and take him. He might hear that, he might not, but they do have super hearing. So that's another thing that helps the animals that survive. That's another characteristic. His coloring for him is a characteristic, because believe me, if he gets away from you, you can't find him, because he is like camouflaged. He kind of camouflages with the ground, which means he looks about the same color as the ground or the trees that are around him. He is a fast runner, as you saw in the beginning of the video. He is very quick. That helps him to get away from prey and also to get away from us. But so these are just some of the characteristics that animals have that help them to survive. In just a minute, we're going to look at some fish and talk about their characteristics as well. Okay, now we're going to talk about fish for just a minute. Fish have physical characteristics that help them to survive as well. I'm going to point one out in my hand and show it to you. As you were seeing in the video, we were watching a fish swim around in the water. One of the things that fish have, is this tail that's here on the end. And that helps them to maneuver and turn around in the water. They also have their fish gills that help them be able to what we call breathe in the water or process oxygen for them to help them survive. They have big eyes, and they're on the side of their head for most fish. Not all fish, but this fish has eyes, so it can see what's coming from in front or on the sides of him. They have a mouth that helps them to eat. And if you notice, he's opening his mouth. So we're going to get him back in the water because we don't want him to die on us. He needs to be in his environment. Fish, there are many kinds of fish in this world, and they all have different adaptations and things that help them to survive. And we're going to be talking more about that with our book in just a little bit. So after talking about animals, like with our fish that we looked at and our dog, our chihuahua that we looked at, we were talking about the characteristics of an animal that help them to survive in their environment. We talked about how the fins help a fish to be able to swim smoothly, and how like Catfish's teeth, the name of our dog, his teeth help him to be able to chew through food and things that he would need to be able to survive. I'm going to read a book. It's called What's Under the Log, and it talks about different animals. So when I'm going through this book, I want you to think about some of the things that animal might have to survive. I also want you to think about the word I mentioned earlier, interdependency. Interdependency means that things from our environment, like the plants, and the trees and the animals. They all have to work together to be able to survive. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the food chain. But I also want you to think about, as we're reading this book, how these animals are depending on other things in our environment. So the name of our book is What's Under the Log. It is written by Ann Hunter. We've got some pretty pictures and some things from nature. What's under the log? A ground beetle. The shiny, hawk-shelled ground beetle lives under most leaves and logs. The ground beetle is a predator that hunts at night for caterpillars and soft-bodied insects. Although it generally travels by foot, the ground beetle has wings under the shiny scale on its back, which it can use to fly short distances. Ground beetles are about a half-inch long. A red eft. The red eft is a newt, which is a type of salamander that begins life underwater. It emerges to spend 1 to 3 years living on land, then returns to the water in life to lay its eggs. In its land stage, a newt is called an eft. Red efts are usually found in moist areas of the forest and lived on a diet of worms and insects. The red eft is 3 to 5 inches in length. Remember, we have learned about measurements, and an inch is about from here to here on your knuckle, here to here. So now we're going to talk about a field cricket. The field cricket lives under the log where it is moist and protected from cool wind and weather. Field crickets feed on seeds, berries, and dead insects. On summer evenings, they sing by scraping their wings over tiny file-like teeth on their backs. An adult field cricket is an inch long. And you can hear the crickets at night in the evenings. They can get loud during the summer. This is a sow bug. The sow bug, also known as a woodlouse, lives under the decaying wood of the log. Sow bugs have 14 legs and their bodies are divided into many segments. The sow bug looks very much like its close relative, the peel bug, which will roll into a ball when startled. An adult sow bug is about 1/3 of an inch long. So that's about a centimeter. And remember, a centimeter is the width of your fingernail. A chipmunk. The quick and industrious chipmunk hides under the log from which such predators as hawks, owls, and foxes. Chipmunks eat seeds, nuts, fruit, and flower bulbs. They store food for the winter in underground tunnels where they also hibernate. A chipmunk is 8 to 10 inches long from nose to tip of tail. So almost the length of a ruler. Ooh, a millipede. We found a couple of these around our pond last week. Millipede is a Latin word that means 1,000 feet. Millipedes don't actually have 1,000 feet, but some kinds do have as many as 700. The millipede's body is divided into many segments, each having a pair of legs. Millipedes feed on plants and often take shelter under old logs. They measure from 1 to 5 inches. Ours were about 3 inches long that we found. A velvet mite. The tiny, brilliant red velvet mite is not much bigger than the head of a pin. Velvet mites have 8 legs and are a relative to spiders. Their diet consists of small insects and insect eggs. Velvet mites are often found on old decaying wood. Ooh, a daddy longlegs. Daddy longlegs are also known as harvestmen. These spiders do not weave webs but travel by foot in search of small insects and plant juices. When nights are cool, groups of the usually solitary daddy longlegs may be found gathered under logs with their legs entwined. Their legs may be as long as 2 inches. Carpenter ants. The big black carpenter ants dig and live in tunnels in decaying wood of the old log. They live in colonies with many ants sharing a tunnel. Carpenter ants feed on insects, plant nectar, and anything containing sugar. They are 1/4 to 1/2 inch in length. Those are some big ants. A garter snake. The garter snake is camouflaged in the leaves and wood of the forest floor by its earthy colored stripes. It often curls under the log for protection from predators or bad weather. Garter snakes feed on worms, frogs, insects, and salamanders. A garter snake may measure from 1.5 to 4 feet. Whoa, they can get long. A tree's life is not over when it falls down and becomes a log on the forest floor. Not only does the log provide a home and a hiding place to many creatures, many more than are shown in this book, but as it decays, the log returns important nutrients to the soil, which feed the new plants and trees that grow to replace the fallen tree. Remember, if you look underneath a log, replace it carefully, since the log is home to so many creatures. Now, throughout this book, I know that it talked about how the creatures in the book depended on the log as a home or for nutrients. Interdependency means that an animal may be depending on grass to eat, and then that grass that is eaten by that animal gives it energy. So that kind of leads us to what we're going to talk about next, is the food chain. At my house, we saw a deer on the dam of our pond, and it had come up from the bottom and it was eating the grass that was up there. Grass is one of the basic starts of the food chain. However, the food chain always starts with energy from the sun. That's the most important thing that you need to remember about the food chain. So the deer that was eating the grass in turn could be eaten by another predator that would be a carnivore that might decide to eat it. A deer is an herbivore, so it eats grass and plants, berries, those sorts of things. Those are called herbivores. Carnivores are animals that eat meat. Then we have omnivores, and omnivores are animals like us that eat vegetables, plants, fruits, and meats. So part of the food chain is working up from the smallest form of life to the largest form, basically. But it all begins with the sun. I have
I'm sorry, but it happened with the
pulling his rod in the water.
read my book, and I want to show you a diagram of the food chain. I have a diagram of the food chain and interdependency. There are lots of parts to the food chain, and if we were in the classroom, we would actually be doing this diagram in your science journal and completing it together. So I'm just going to go over this real quick, and then I'm going to read our short book about what is a food chain. So food chain represents the flow of energy from the sun through producers and consumers in an environment. Interdependency means that it is a beneficial relationship between organisms that depend on one another. They help each other out, even though they may not want to. The sun provides energy for all living organisms. Major concept for you to remember. And then an organism is a living thing that can function on its own. And an environment is all the living and non-living things in that geographic area. For example, we just read the log book. Well, the logbook is the log was non-living, but it was full of living organisms. So part of that environment was that log that was in the forest. It had living trees and plants around it. It had living animals around it. But the combination of the environment is all of those things. So let's talk about what's part of the food chain and what these arrows mean. So like I said, the food chain always starts with the basic energy of the sun. The sunlight is taken in by plants, and here I have an example of grass. And plants are producers, which means that's an organism that makes or produces its own food. So plants actually make their own food, and they make their own food through a process of photosynthesis. The sun gives energy to the plants, so it's like the energy goes into, if plants have a stomach, it would go into the tummy of plants. They don't really have a stomach, but that's the way we're going to talk about it. So then that energy from the plant goes into the tummy of a rabbit, and that's why the arrows are pointing to those animals in that order, because it comes from the sun to the plant and now to the rabbit. The rabbit eats plants, so the energy from that plant now is in the rabbit's tummy. And then rabbits are consumers, and consumers are organisms that eat other organisms for food, like a rabbit eating grass and a fox eating a rabbit. So if you look next, the rabbit gets eaten by the fox. So the energy from the rabbit goes into the fox and creates energy for it. Foxes are also carnivores that we were talking about earlier. And consumers that eat other organisms are usually at the top of the food chain. However, we are the highest part of that food chain because we have intelligence and we can think past what other animals think as far as the food chain and being able to get sources of food. That's a quick review of food chain and interdependency. I'm going to read a nonfiction book now that's called What is a Food Chain? So the next book I'm reading is called What is a Food Chain? And it's a nonfiction book that will have nonfiction features in it, and it's written by Heather Nicole. So what is a food chain? Here's our table of contents. Very short. Here are the plants that grow in the pond. So here we have plants that are growing. They look like lily pads. Who eats the plants that grow by the pond? Think about your food chain. Who might be eating those plants? The insects eat the plants. So here we have an insect eating on the plants in the pond. Who eats the insects that eat the plants that grow by the pond? So who do you think is going to eat the insects next? It's got to be something bigger in the food chain. Oh, the fish eats the insect. Who eats the fish that eats the insect that eats the plant that grow by the pond? So think about it a minute. Who do you think is going to eat that fish? I know Miss Simpson sure likes to go fishing. Oh my goodness, the bird eats the fish. But children eat the fish too. So they must have gone fishing and caught some fish to eat for dinner. So here's an example of a food chain. We have the plants in the pond are eaten by the insect, and here the arrows are. So the plant goes inside the insect's tummy, the insect goes inside the fish's tummy, and the fish goes inside the heron's tummy. And remember, at the beginning of this food chain is going to be what? Always? Sunlight. It's going to be sunlight. So to kind of conclude our lesson for today, I just want to remind you that animals have basic needs. We talked about plant needs last week. We said that plant animals have most of the basic same needs. There were two differences. And on the screen we have plants need nutrients, sunlight, air, space to grow, and water. Animals need food and shelter. but they also need air, space to grow, and water. So basic needs for plants and animals are the same, except for food is for animals. Nutrients plants make their own food with nutrients and photosynthesis, but animals need shelter. Um, Also remember that it's important that we take care of our environment, because a lot of things depend on us. The land depends on us, the animals depend on us, and they all depend on each other. So we all have a relationship together. One thing I do want to mention is that with plants, and especially with trees, that when we cut those down, it's good to replace them, because they also produce oxygen for us to breathe, and then we produce carbon monoxide that they need as part of their process of growing. So there's another example of interdependency. It's not just with food in the food chain. So we are all interdependent on one another. Um, it's a good time just to remember to do your reuse, recycle, reduce the things that you use. It's a good time to remind you of that. And next week we'll be talking about migration, hibernation, dormancy, and the insect life cycle. So I will see y'all next week. Mwah.